The orange glow from Duncan MacLeod's cabin could be seen from half a mile away on cold winter nights, horizontal stripes of firelight shining through gaps in his front wall that neighbors called the work of a fool. But on the morning Moira Kincaid slipped on her ice-covered doorstep and shattered her wrist, she looked across the clearing at Duncan's bone-dry entrance and finally understood what everyone else had missed. Before we get into how one trapper's strange construction choice changed frontier building forever, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten wilderness ingenuity speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. The year was 1839, and the Montana Territory spring had arrived with the cruelty that only mountain weather could deliver. Duncan MacLeod and Callum Fraser had spent the winter trapping beaver along the tributaries of the Madison River, and their season had been profitable enough to justify another year in the wilderness. They had survived hostile encounters with Blackfoot hunting parties, 2 grizzly bear encounters, and the kind of cold that made men question their sanity. What they hadn't survived was the simple act of coming home. April 14th brought an unexpected ice storm, the kind of late-season weather that caught trappers off guard because they had already started thinking about spring. Duncan had been checking the southern trap line while Callum worked the northern circuit. They had separated at dawn with plans to meet back at the cabin by midday. The storm came in fast around 10 in the morning, temperatures dropping 20 degrees in an hour, freezing rain coating everything in a layer of treacherous ice. Duncan finished his circuit and headed back through the storm, concerned but not alarmed. They had weathered worse. The cabin appeared normal when he arrived 2 hours later, smoke rising from the chimney, door closed against the weather. He called out as he approached, expecting Callum to respond from inside. Silence greeted him instead. He found Callum on the doorstep, halfway between the door and the ground, his body already cold. The ice coating, the wooden step, told the story Duncan didn't want to read. Callum had returned during the storm, stepped onto the ice-covered threshold, and slipped. His head had struck the door frame with enough force to kill him almost instantly. There were no bears, no hostile warriors, no dramatic final stand against the wilderness, just ice on a doorstep and a moment of lost balance. Duncan buried his partner on a hillside overlooking the creek they had worked together for 2 seasons. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in the cabin alone, unable to process the absurdity of it. They had prepared for every dramatic danger the mountains could throw at them, but a slippery doorstep had proven deadlier than anything they had feared. The realization came slowly over the following days. Duncan began paying attention to something he had always ignored. Every cabin he had ever inhabited or visited had the same problem. Doorsteps accumulated ice during winter. Door frames collected moisture from cooking, steam, breath, and snow tracked inside. Wood rot started at the threshold and worked its way up the door frame. Within 3 to 5 years, every cabin door needed replacement because the constant moisture cycle destroyed the wood. Most mountain men accepted this reality without question. Replacing doors was part of frontier life, as inevitable as sharpening knives or patching clothing. But Duncan couldn't accept it anymore. Callum had died because of a problem everyone treated as unsolvable, and that fact transformed Duncan's grief into obsession. There had to be a way to keep cabin entries dry. Duncan spent the next 6 weeks visiting every trapper camp within 20 miles of his location. He wasn't socializing or trading information about beaver populations. He was studying doorsteps with the intensity of a man possessed. What he discovered confirmed his suspicion that Callum's death represented a universal problem that everyone had simply learned to tolerate. Fergus O'Brien's cabin sat in a sheltered valley 8 miles west of Duncan's location. Fergus was an experienced trapper who had survived 9 winters in the mountains, and his cabin showed the wear of constant use. Duncan arrived early one morning in May and watched Fergus spend 15 minutes chipping ice off his doorstep with a hatchet, cursing steadily while he worked. The ice had formed overnight despite relatively mild temperatures, created by moisture escaping from inside the cabin that froze on the cold wooden threshold. At another camp, Duncan met an elderly trapper named Silas who walked with a pronounced limp. Silas explained that he had slipped on his icy doorstep the previous winter and nearly broken his leg. He had been alone at the time, and a broken leg in the wilderness meant death. He had been lucky, escaping with only torn ligaments and a permanent limp. He showed Duncan his door frame, pointing out the dark water stains and soft spots where rot had begun eating away at the wood. The pattern repeated at every cabin Duncan visited. Ice formed on doorsteps during cold weather, created by the temperature differential between warm cabin interiors and cold exterior wood. Moisture accumulated from multiple sources. Every time someone entered or exited, they brought cold air that mixed with warm interior air, creating condensation. Cooking fires produced steam that had nowhere to go in sealed cabins. Human breath added moisture to the air constantly. Snow tracked in on boots melted and added to the problem. Traditional cabin design offered no solution to this moisture cycle. Trappers built their cabins to be as sealed as possible against the elements, using mud and moss to chink every gap between logs. This kept out wind and rain, but it also trapped moisture inside. That moisture had to go somewhere, and it inevitably accumulated at the coldest point, which was almost always the door and threshold area where interior warmth met exterior cold. Duncan documented the consequences with grim thoroughness. Every cabin he examined showed doorframe rot. Some had replaced their doors once already. Others were approaching the point where replacement would become necessary. The process required finding suitable wood, having the tools and hardware to build a new door, and spending days on construction while leaving the cabin exposed to weather and potential intruders. The economic cost was substantial, but the human cost concerned Duncan more. He learned of 3 other trappers who had been injured by falls on icy doorsteps in the past 2 years. One had broken his collarbone. Another had suffered a severe concussion. The third had torn ligaments in his knee badly enough that he had abandoned trapping and returned to civilization. Most trappers simply accepted these dangers as the price of mountain life. Duncan could not. Duncan left the mountains in June of 1839 with his season's furs packed on 2 horses. The journey to Street. Louis took 3 weeks through country that was becoming increasingly traveled as more settlers pushed westward. He sold his beaver pelts for a decent profit at the trading house near the riverfront, and then he did something that puzzled every trapper who knew him. Instead of spending his money on whiskey and entertainment, he spent 2 weeks studying buildings. Street. Louis in 1839 was a growing city where frontier met civilization, and its buildings represented construction techniques that mountain men rarely encountered. Duncan walked the streets with the focus of a man on a mission, examining structures that most people passed without a second glance. He wasn't interested in the grand hotels or impressive churches. He was looking for buildings that solved heat and moisture problems. He found his first lesson at a blacksmith's forge near the warehouse district. The forge itself was housed in a sturdy brick building, and Duncan noticed immediately that the entrance area remained completely dry despite the heat and steam produced by the metalworking inside. He watched the blacksmith work for an hour, studying how heat from the forge created air currents that flowed toward the large front opening. The smith noticed his attention and explained the principle without being asked. Hot air rises and moves toward cooler areas, carrying moisture with it. The large front opening allowed that moisture-laden air to escape instead of condensing on walls or floor. Duncan spent an entire afternoon at a warehouse on the riverfront where workers loaded and unloaded freight regardless of weather. The warehouse had a covered loading dock that remained remarkably dry even during rain. Duncan examined the structure carefully and realized that the building's design created a warm zone at the entrance. Heat from the interior warehouse space, combined with strategic airflow, kept the loading area several degrees warmer than the surrounding exterior. Rain that fell on the dock evaporated quickly instead of freezing or creating puddles. He talked his way into observing a hotel construction site where a man identified as an architect was supervising the installation of a heating system. Duncan asked questions carefully, not wanting to reveal his ignorance. The architect explained radiant heat principles in terms Duncan could understand. Heat moves from warm areas to cold areas through 3 methods: conduction through solid materials, convection through air movement, and radiation through space. Control those movements, and you control where heat goes and what it does. The key insight came during a conversation with a carpenter working on a merchant's house. Duncan asked about preventing moisture damage to door frames. The carpenter's answer was simple but revolutionary to Duncan's thinking. You can't stop moisture from forming in occupied buildings. Humans breathe, cook, and track in weather. The solution isn't preventing moisture. The solution is giving it somewhere to go before it causes damage. Duncan purchased measuring tools, iron brackets for reinforcement, and a small notebook where he sketched ideas. He returned to the mountains in late July with knowledge that no other trapper possessed. Duncan returned to the mountains with a plan that made perfect sense to him and would look like complete madness to everyone else. He selected a new cabin site in early August, choosing high ground 50 yards from the creek with clear sight lines in all directions. The location required hauling water uphill, but it provided visibility and drainage that low ground couldn't offer. He began construction with methodical care that surprised the few trappers who passed through and observed his work. The foundation came first, an unusual feature for a mountain cabin. Most trappers simply built directly on the ground or at most laid a few flat rocks under corner logs. Duncan dug a shallow trench around his cabin's perimeter and filled it with carefully selected stones, creating a level base that would prevent settling. The process took 4 days. Passing trappers shook their heads at the wasted effort, but said nothing. Duncan had always been thorough to the point of obsession. The 3 walls went up next, and here Duncan's work followed traditional methods that any experienced builder would recognize. He selected logs with obsessive care, rejecting any with significant taper or irregularity. Each log was stripped completely of bark and shaped to consistent diameter. The corner joints used traditional saddle notches, fitted so precisely that gaps were minimal. Between each log, Duncan packed a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin that he had prepared over several days. The side and back walls represented frontier construction at its finest, built to standards that would make any master carpenter nod with approval. Then he started the front wall, and the mockery began immediately. Fergus O'Brien arrived on the day Duncan laid the 4th log of his front wall. He watched in silence as Duncan carefully positioned the log, using wooden spacers to maintain exactly 4 inches of open gap between it and the log below. Fergus stared at the obvious gap, then at Duncan, then back at the gap. "Did you run out of chinking material?" Fergus asked, his tone suggesting he already knew something was wrong. Duncan explained his plan calmly. The gaps would allow heat from his interior fire to flow through the front wall, keeping the entry area warm and dry. The side and back walls would be sealed tight for heat retention, but the front wall would function as a controlled heat distributor. Radiant warmth flowing through the gaps would prevent ice formation on his doorstep and keep his door frame dry, preventing the rot that destroyed every cabin door within 5 years. Fergus listened to the entire explanation, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to outright amusement. When Duncan finished, Fergus laughed loud enough to startle birds from nearby trees. "MacLeod, you've lost your mind," Fergus said, still laughing. "You're building a cabin to heat the forest. That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen, and I once watched a man try to train a beaver." Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Duncan MacLeod was building a cabin with holes in it. The grief over Callum's death had clearly broken something in his mind. Duncan ignored the mockery and continued building with precision that bordered on mathematical. Every aspect of his front wall construction followed principles he had learned in street. Louis, adapted to the materials and tools available in the wilderness. What looked like madness to observers was actually engineering disguised as frontier carpentry. The front wall logs were selected with even greater care than those used for the other 3 walls. Duncan needed logs of absolutely uniform diameter, and he spent 2 full weeks finding and cutting timber that met his requirements. Each log measured 10 inches in diameter from end to end with minimal taper. He rejected dozens of perfectly serviceable logs that any other trapper would have used without hesitation. The rejected logs became firewood. Only the most uniform specimens made it into his front wall. The gap spacing required precise calculation. Duncan had determined through his Street Lewis observations that 4 inches provided optimal airflow. Smaller gaps would restrict heat distribution. Larger gaps would waste heat without additional benefit. He maintained this spacing using temporary wooden wedges cut to exact dimensions. Each log was positioned, checked for level, and secured before he removed the spacers and moved to the next. Of course, the gaps themselves were angled, though the angle was subtle enough that casual observers missed it entirely. Duncan shaped the top edge of each log so that the gap tilted slightly downward toward the exterior. This prevented rain from entering while allowing warm air to flow outward freely. The angle was only about 5 degrees, but it made the difference between a system that worked and one that would fail during the first storm. While his front wall rose with its obvious gaps, Duncan built his side and back walls with double-thickness chinking. He packed his clay mixture into the spaces between logs, then added a second layer after the first had dried. These walls were sealed so thoroughly that not even smoke could escape through them. The contrast was deliberate and essential. 3 super-insulated walls would retain far more heat than 4 walls with standard chinking. The front wall gaps represented controlled heat loss, not wasteful design. The interior fireplace placement was equally calculated. Duncan positioned it on the back wall, directly opposite the front entrance. Heat from the fire would naturally move toward the cooler front of the cabin. The stone fireplace itself was built with a narrow chimney and a smoke shelf that reflected heat back into the room rather than letting it escape upward. Every element worked together to push warmth toward the front wall. Duncan constructed the door frame to integrate with his gap system. The frame was positioned so that gaps ran both above and below it, creating a complete envelope of warm air around the entire doorway. The door itself was built from 3-inch thick planks reinforced with iron brackets, heavy enough to hold its shape but fitted precisely enough that it didn't interfere with the heat flow pattern when closed. The construction took 9 weeks from foundation to completion. A standard cabin required 5 days. The first snow arrived in early October of 1839, earlier than usual and heavy enough to blanket the mountains in white overnight. Duncan had finished his cabin only 3 days earlier, and the timing felt almost providential. He would test his design under real winter conditions immediately, with no gradual adjustment period to ease into the system. He lit his first fire in the new fireplace on the morning of October 7th. The stone chimney drew perfectly, pulling smoke upward without backdrafts or interior haze. Within 30 minutes, the cabin's interior had warmed to comfortable temperature. Duncan sat on his sleeping platform and waited, watching the front wall with the attention of a man whose entire theory was about to face judgment. The heat began flowing through the gaps within the first hour. Duncan couldn't see the air movement directly, but he could see its effects. The snow that had fallen on his front porch and doorstep began melting, even though exterior temperature remained well below freezing. He stepped outside and held his hand near the gaps. Warm air flowed outward in steady streams, creating a perceptible heat zone that extended 3 feet from the cabin's front face. By midday, his doorstep was completely clear and dry. The wood itself felt warm to the touch. Snow continued falling throughout the afternoon, but any flakes that landed on his entry area melted immediately. The wooden step remained as dry as if it were inside the cabin rather than exposed to the weather. That evening, as full darkness settled over the mountains, Duncan's cabin began to glow. The firelight from his interior hearth shone through the front wall gaps, creating horizontal stripes of orange light that looked like nothing anyone in the territory had ever seen. The effect was striking enough that Fergus O'Brien, whose cabin was nearly a mile away across the valley, could see it clearly. Fergus stood outside his own cabin that night, staring at the glowing stripes in disbelief. He assumed Duncan was burning an enormous amount of firewood, wasting heat in a display of stubborn foolishness. Fergus went to bed convinced that Duncan would run out of wood by midwinter and come begging for help. The next morning brought the real test. Duncan woke at dawn and stepped outside into air cold enough to make his breath visible in thick clouds. His doorstep was clear, dry, and safe. He walked down the step without caution, his boots finding solid purchase on warm wood. Across the valley, Fergus O'Brien woke to the same dawn and opened his cabin door onto a doorstep covered in treacherous ice. The moisture that had escaped his cabin overnight had frozen on the wooden threshold, creating a surface as slick as river rock. Fergus nearly fell just stepping outside. He caught himself on the doorframe and stood there, breathing hard from the close call. He looked across the valley toward Duncan's cabin. Even in daylight, he could make out the distinctive gaps in the front wall. The winter of 1839 to 1840 became legendary across the northern Rockies for its brutal cold and relentless freeze-thaw cycles. Temperatures would plummet to 20 below zero for days at a time, then rise suddenly to just above freezing before dropping again. These cycles created ice conditions that tested every structure and every trapper's endurance. For Duncan MacLeod, the winter became an extended validation of everything he had built. The pattern established itself within the first month. Every cabin in the region, except Duncan's, developed thick ice accumulations on doorsteps and entry areas. Trappers spent 20 to 30 minutes each morning chipping ice with hatchets and knives, trying to create safe passage in and out of their own homes. The work was dangerous, tedious, and had to be repeated daily. Missing even one morning meant ice buildup that could take an hour to clear. Duncan walked out of his cabin every morning onto a doorstep that remained dry and clear regardless of overnight temperatures. The heat flowing through his front wall gaps maintained the entry area several degrees above freezing at all times. Snow that fell on his porch melted immediately. Moisture that would have frozen on the wood simply evaporated into the air. His morning routine involved checking trap lines, not chipping ice. The injuries began in December. A trapper named William Moss slipped on his icy doorstep and broke 2 fingers when his hand struck the doorframe. A week later, another man twisted his ankle badly enough that he could barely walk for a month. Moira Kincaid, who lived with her husband in a cabin 4 miles from Duncan's location, fell twice on her own doorstep before mid-January. The second fall left her bruised and shaken, though not seriously injured. Young Declan Ross visited Duncan's cabin in late January, ostensibly to trade for coffee, but actually to see the gap wall design everyone discussed. Declan stepped onto Duncan's porch and immediately noticed the warmth. The wooden planks felt warm under his boots. The air near the front wall was noticeably warmer than the surrounding atmosphere. Inside, the cabin was comfortable without being stifling, and Declan realized immediately that Duncan wasn't burning excessive amounts of firewood. The interior temperature felt stable and even. "How much wood are you using per day?" Declan asked, running his hand along the interior side of the front wall. Duncan showed him the wood pile. His consumption was actually lower than most trappers managed. 3 well-insulated walls retained heat more efficiently than 4 walls with standard chinking. The front wall gaps represented controlled heat distribution, not waste. Angus Donovan, an elder frontiersman who had spent 15 winters in the mountains, made a special trip to examine Duncan's cabin in February. He studied the construction for nearly an hour, asking technical questions about gap spacing, heat flow, and wood consumption. Finally, he straightened and looked at Duncan with something approaching respect. "I've seen forge work in Pittsburgh," Angus said quietly, "but I never thought to use the principle on a cabin." The ice storm struck on March 9, 1840, with a ferocity that caught everyone unprepared. Spring had seemed imminent just days earlier, with temperatures climbing and snow beginning to melt. Then Arctic air swept down from the north and collided with moisture moving up from the south. Freezing rain fell for 18 hours straight, coating everything in layers of ice that built up faster than anyone could clear them. Moira Kincaid was 8 months pregnant and moving carefully even under normal circumstances. Her husband had left at dawn to check their trap lines before the storm arrived, planning to return by midday. The storm came earlier than expected, and Moira found herself alone in their cabin as freezing rain hammered against the walls. By afternoon, she was worried enough about her husband that she decided to step outside and look for any sign of his return. Her doorstep had accumulated nearly an inch of ice during the storm. The wooden threshold was invisible beneath the glassy coating. Moira opened the door carefully, aware of the danger, but needing to see if her husband was approaching. She placed her right foot on the step, testing her weight slowly. The ice held for a moment, then her boot slipped sideways. She fell hard, twisting as she went down in an instinctive effort to protect her pregnant belly. Her right wrist took the full impact as she tried to catch herself. The bone shattered with an audible crack that she heard clearly despite the storm. Pain flooded through her arm in waves that made her gasp. She lay on the ice-covered step, cradling her damaged wrist, unable to stand without risking another fall. Her husband found her 10 minutes later and carried her through the storm to Duncan's cabin, which was the closest help available. The journey took 20 minutes, through conditions that made every step treacherous. Duncan's cabin appeared through the freezing rain like a beacon, and when they reached his porch, Moira's husband nearly wept with relief. The doorstep was completely clear and dry. They walked up onto the porch without slipping, and the warmth radiating from the front wall gaps felt like salvation. Duncan brought them inside and examined Moira's wrist while she sat near his fire, still shaking from shock and pain. The break was clean but severe. He splinted it carefully using materials he kept for exactly these situations, working with steady hands while Moira bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, her splinted wrist cradled in her lap, staring at nothing. Then she looked up at Duncan, tears running down her face. "How is there no ice on your doorstep?" she asked, her voice breaking. The storm just ended. Duncan explained the system quietly while her husband listened. When he finished, Moira began crying harder, though not from physical pain. "Callum didn't have to die," she whispered. "None of us have to fall." Fergus O'Brien appeared at Duncan's cabin 3 days after the ice storm, walking across snow that had finally stopped falling. He stood on the dry porch for a long moment before knocking, looking down at the clear wooden planks beneath his boots. When Duncan opened the door, Fergus didn't offer greeting or explanation. He simply asked a question he had never thought he would need to ask. "Will you help me rebuild my cabin?" Fergus said quietly. "Using your system." Duncan agreed without hesitation. They began work in April of 1840, as soon as weather permitted construction. Fergus watched every step of the process with careful attention, asking questions about gap spacing, log selection, and heat flow patterns. His new cabin took 6 weeks to complete, twice as long as traditional construction but far faster than Duncan's first attempt had required. When Fergus lit his first fire and watched heat begin flowing through his front wall gaps, he stood outside in the evening darkness and stared at the horizontal stripes of glowing light with something approaching wonder. Declan Ross built his first cabin that summer using Duncan's technique. He was young enough that building properly from the beginning made more sense than learning bad habits and correcting them later. His cabin went up in a valley 12 miles south of Duncan's location, and when word reached the scattered trapping community that another gap-front cabin existed, curiosity began replacing mockery. Seamus Brennan, who operated the trading post at the nearest settlement, started noticing a pattern in his supply orders. Trappers were requesting iron brackets, measuring tools, and specific materials for chinking that hadn't been common purchases before. When he asked about the unusual orders, multiple customers mentioned McLeod's design. Seamus made a trip into the mountains specifically to see Duncan's cabin, examined it thoroughly, and returned to his trading post, convinced that the technique represented genuine innovation worth supporting. By summer of 1841, 7 cabins in the northern Montana region used gap-front design. The technique spread through direct observation and word-of-mouth recommendation. Trappers who had initially mocked Duncan now asked him for advice on measurements and construction details. He shared everything freely, never attempting to claim ownership or charge for the knowledge. His reasoning was simple. More people building safe cabins meant fewer deaths from preventable accidents. Variations began emerging as different builders adapted the core principle to their specific needs and available materials. Some used 3-inch gaps instead of 4. Others experimented with 5-inch spacing. A few tried different gap angles or alternative chinking materials. The principle remained consistent across all variations. Strategic controlled heat loss through the front wall prevented entry zone failure, while 3 well-insulated walls maintained overall thermal efficiency. Word reached other trapping regions through the network of trading posts and seasonal gatherings where mountain men exchanged information. The phrase McCloud Front became shorthand for the design, though Duncan never promoted the name. By 1842, cabins incorporating his technique existed in Wyoming and Idaho territories. The innovation spread because it solved a real problem that everyone had experienced. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed between 1843 and 1845. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in accessible areas, and more significantly, fashion had shifted. Silk replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market that had driven men into the wilderness for 2 decades. Trappers began leaving the mountains in steady streams, heading west to Oregon, south to California, or back east to civilization they had left behind years earlier. Duncan McCloud left the mountains in the spring of 1845. He had saved money during his trapping years, and he used it to purchase land in the Oregon Territory near the Willamette Valley. He married a widow named Catherine in 1846, a woman who had crossed the continent with her family and lost her first husband to cholera during the journey. They started a small farm together, raised 3 children, and built a life that had nothing to do with beaver pelts or wilderness survival. Duncan never returned to the mountains. His children grew up knowing their father had been a trapper once, but the details remained vague. He didn't tell stories about grizzly bears or hostile encounters. He rarely mentioned the years he had spent alone in the wilderness. When his eldest son asked about his time in the mountains, Duncan would say only that he had learned some things about building and had been fortunate to come out alive, but the cabins remained. Scattered across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, gap front structures stood weathering seasons long after their builders had departed. Settlers moving west under the Homestead Act of 1862 discovered these abandoned cabins and recognized immediately that they represented superior construction. The entry areas remained dry. The doorframes showed no rot. The structures had survived decades with minimal maintenance, while traditional cabins, built in the same era, had collapsed from wood decay and structural failure. New inhabitants occupied the old trapper cabins, maintained them, and learned from their design. Homesteaders building their own structures incorporated the gap front principle, adapting it to farming settlements rather than trapping camps. Military outposts used heated entry zones for guard stations, where soldiers needed to maintain watch during brutal winter conditions. Trading posts adopted the design because warm, welcoming entrances improved customer comfort and business. The number of lives saved by the technique remained unmeasurable but real. Fewer people fell on icy doorsteps. Fewer cabins required complete reconstruction due to door rot. Fewer families faced exposure during emergency door replacements in the middle of winter. The prevention of small disasters accumulated into significance that no one could quantify precisely. Duncan McCloud died in 1869 at age 58 on his Oregon farm, surrounded by his wife and children. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, dates, and the simple designation farmer. There was no mention of mountains, cabins, or innovations that had changed how people survived on the frontier. But across the Rockies on cold winter nights, cabins still glowed with horizontal stripes of orange light, standing as testament to what one man had understood about keeping people safe.